super excited to be following another history talk. I think that's really, really relevant to remember where we came from so that we know where we're going. So like Lindsay said, my name is Whitney. I'm a front-end developer from Greenville, South Carolina. And two of my favorite things are JavaScript and Germany. So I think that speaking on stage here is like the best thing ever. If you have any questions, you can tweet at me on Twitter. I'm also fluent in German, so if you have questions, you can ask me in the hallway in German. You could ask me on Twitter in German. Unfortunately, the whole talk is in English. So this talk is about ideas and not aesthetics. For many people, the Bauhaus style is associated with a particular aesthetic. It has a particular look. And while it's true that the Bauhaus left behind a distinct visual legacy, it's the school and its makers left behind something that's way, way more important than this sort of visual style. And that's a way of thinking. And so for this talk, we'll focus a lot more on the visual, or a lot less on the visual, and a lot more on the methodology and the reasoning behind it. And so, in other words, we're going to focus a lot more on the what, and a lot more on the why, and less on the what. So because the visual legacy is also important, I've tried to include a lot of that stuff, the pictures in my talk. But hopefully, you'll get a picture of the idea that it's more than just this sort of look. So the industrialization of the 19th century, the end of World War I, and the dissolution of the German monarchy brought about social and political changes without which the Bauhaus would have been pretty much inconceivable. It came about at a time when everything was changing, and Germany was really undergoing a revolution, not just in design, but just in the entire country. And it's something I think is really, really interesting. At this time, factories, for the first time, were really starting to mass produce stuff. That happened starting inexpensively in the mid-1880s, but most of the stuff that was designed and produced was of incredibly awful quality. It was that sort of throwaway product where it was good for a little while, and then all of a sudden, once it broke, there was no fixing it. It was just, you threw it out. So the arts and crafts movement came along and switched everything up, and they said, we really want to make something that's beautiful, and it's amazing, and it's not mass-produced. We want to make something that's the complete opposite of that. And so in the 1860s, they started to try and reconcile decoration with design, so this idea that stuff had a lot of detail and a lot of really beautiful surface sort of stuff on top of it. And this was something that factory-made goods beforehand just plain old didn't have and could not reproduce. So the Bauhaus was formed from a merger of Saxony's Kunstgewerbeschule and the Kunstschule, and I say those in German because there are no English words for them. Basically, it means art school. So the technical title was Staatliches Bauhaus. It was formed in April 1919, and they sought to work within the limitations of less expensive materials and really produce something that was of really, really nice quality, and it was also well-designed. So they hoped to sort of bring these two ideas together and say, okay, we can make something that's beautiful and it's functional, but it's also affordable to the everyday person. And the other thing that Gropius really tried to do was that he tried to build and shape a new kind of designer and a human being that he thought could change the world, really. So the big question I'm going to try and ask today is, how have the Bauhaus ideas and approaches stood the test of time? How are they still relevant today, almost 80 years later? So the school's founder, Walter Gropius, like I said, he hoped to create this new designer, this new human being that could change the world. Less than 4 years after its founding, the school was internationally known and had become a meeting place for the European avant-garde. In an industry that's constantly changing and seeking the next big thing, I want to really look at how almost 100 years later, the Bauhaus has sort of, in this style and this idea of how we design and how we write our JavaScript, has sort of experienced a resurgence in popularity. So to shape the new designer envisioned by Gropius, education at the Bauhaus was not just limited strictly to academic knowledge, but they really encouraged experimentation, collaborative learning, even this idea of cultivation of friendly interaction between the masters and the students, and so that you had a lot of this stuff like Bauhaus parties that were legendary. They had the white party, the yellow party, the red party, and I went and visited the Bauhaus, and if you see the architecture and if you see this sort of the atmosphere that they built, it's incredible how everything all sort of came into not just a school and learning and sitting in a classroom, but really a lifestyle. It was incredibly interesting how they did it and did it very differently. Unfortunately, I think 100 years later, our industry has kind of lost its way. And unlike at the Bauhaus, where they tried to create this sort of collaborative movement and lifestyle, we've really kind of gone off the rails. And far from cultivating friendly interaction, we really are struggling as a community to build a welcoming, cohesive community. And instead, a lot of times, we're building up barriers that are not just senseless, but they stand in the way of real progress. And we tend to sort of surround ourselves with people who think like us, they look like us, they talk like us. We end up sort of seeking out inspiration just from within our tiny circles, and I think that's a huge mistake. One of the most, I guess, important, or for me, personal sort of struggles in the JavaScript community is this just ridiculous split between designers and developers. And I think it's really, really harmful. I think we can do stuff together. So rather than collaborating, to achieve common goals, designers and developers, I think a lot of times we really feel like, hey, we're on competing teams. We're fighting against each other, and we can't, kind of come together and say, hey, at the end of the day, all we want to do is just ship a product. And that goes together. We're all in this together. So this uneasiness sort of, it stands in the way of successful collaboration. In reality, the principles of good design often mirror those of good development. So while it can't be said that the school and its masters sort of achieved this harmonious atmosphere that Gropius had sort of set forth in his Bauhaus manifesto back in 1919, instead, the Bauhaus was incredibly progressive for its time, and Gropius believed that through the process of modernization, he could master that via design, and that the arts and crafts would form the foundation of all activity. And so he really wanted to bring everything together sort of under one umbrella. And unlike the European art schools of the time, he actually, which typically taught art and design as two totally separate subjects, never together, the Bauhaus decided to really bring those two together and reverse the split between art and production, which up until that point really hadn't been done. It was either you were a fine artist or you were a designer, and you were never both. And that's something I think is really, really interesting, this idea that, hey, we do have these roots in fine arts, we do have these roots in crafts, and it's something that's very important. So the struggle to reconcile the fine and applied arts that was happening back then in the early 20th century, that really, for me, mirrors our development community's struggle to reconcile code with design. And a lot of times we blame the complexity of modern websites, of modern apps, and we say, hey, we really need an increasing amount of specialization from today's designers and developers, and we forget that even back then, there was this huge challenge of physical architecture and building, and similarly, we still face those same kinds of challenges. It's still difficult. I think that the way that we fix this is to move away from tiny circles. We move away from picking sides. We move away, and we sort of shape and create a community that we can be proud of. And that's going to be a community where developers and designers, they really work with each other instead of against each other. And I think that's the first step for me. So in the Bauhaus, in order to prepare students, they instituted an innovative foundational course that Gropius hoped would, and he called this, liberate the pupil's individuality from the dead weight of conventions. And so he really wanted to get away from all of this sort of old master stuff. And so the the foundational course, the 4 course, was originally taught by Johannes Itten. And he was this really sort of eccentric, weird Swiss painter guy. And his aim was to form the creative individual. And so for the first time, instead of looking at the old master's works and then just copying them, Itten said, hey, okay, let's look at these works. Let's tell us sort of what's happening here. Let's learn form, let's learn color, let's learn composition. Let's learn all of these things that the masters are teaching us, but instead of copying that work, let's just go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to take my inspiration from this, but I'm going to make something myself. So I'm going to learn by creating and not by copying. So by 1923, Gropius had sort of started to shift his ideas a little bit. Itten, like I said, was a little bit of a weird guy. His increasing focus on individual artistic expression, as well as his involvement in this religious group / cult called the Mazdanan religious group, started to really irritate Gropius, and things went a little bit off the rails. Gropius desired a more intense collaboration with technology. He really wanted to make that the focus, and so Itten was dismissed. And instead, they transferred the leadership of the 4 course to 2 new people, Joseph Albers and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And they cemented a shift toward a more successful integration of design, technology, and industrial production. This course, then the 4 course, became one of the Bauhaus's most defining pedagogical features. And it's something that actually, as a designer, still exists in many design schools today. It's something that really changed the way that we think about design, the way that we teach design, and it's still incredibly, incredibly relevant. The other thing that they came up with was this idea that form follows function. The quote itself, form follows function, was actually from an American. It's not from the Bauhaus, which is why I didn't put it in the slides. But yeah, so this idea that everything has a purpose. So after this increasing political and economic pressure from the conservative parties in Thuringen forced the Bauhaus out of Weimar, they needed to find a new location. So in 1925, the school relocated to Dessau. They have an incredible museum that I would really recommend that you all go to if you're at all interested. The one here in Berlin is unfortunately A, not friendly, and B, not interesting. It was here in Dessau that Gropius founded the new building, so the Bauhausgebäude. He also built houses for the masters, the Bauhaus teachers, essentially, to live in, and these are called the Meisterhäuser. And they really started attracting, with the opening of these buildings, significant interest both from inside of Germany itself, but also from abroad. So as industrial output rose, the German population became a lot more urbanized. They started living a lot more in cities. So Gropius again started criticizing the workshops, lamenting the lack of focus on industrial mass production and technology. For him, technology was incredibly, incredibly important. And so he had an almost singular focus on this. And a lot of times, at the time, his contemporaries said, hey, we really think that this is a mistake. But looking back in retrospect, it's this stubborn quality that actually made the Bauhaus so incredibly revolutionary. It was this embracing of technology, this embracing of change, this saying, hey, we know that this is different. We don't care. We're going to do it anyway. We think it's the right thing to do. Similarly, the modern web is evolving at a super, super incredibly fast rate. And we either face this challenge of, hey, we're going to adapt, or we're going to be left behind. And listening to a lot of the other talks that talk about ES 2015, it's pretty obvious that if you don't learn this stuff now, you probably don't have a career as a JavaScripter, say 2 years from now, 3 years from now, certainly not 10 years from now. So that's something I think we really need to keep into consideration. So as JavaScript developers, we're really seeking to push the boundaries of the web. We're designing, we're developing new features, new experiences that weren't possible a couple of years ago. They may not even have been popular or possible a couple of months ago. And so we complain a lot about, oh my God, we really have to learn these new frameworks. We have to learn how to build these new features. We have to learn these new tools. We have to scaffold our sites and applications, and there's so much stuff to get through, and we complain a lot. Oops. But one thing I think we kind of forget is that being revolutionary means taking risks. It means challenging ourselves and saying, hey, we're ready for this. And it's easy to forget that the challenges that we face today are not unique to us and our culture and our time. They're very different from the challenges that Gropius faced, but at the same time, they're also incredibly similar. We're still facing this sort of pressure to move forward. We're facing this pressure to reinvent ourselves, to keep learning, to keep making, to keep doing, to keep sort of always churning out new work. And it's exhausting, and it was exhausting back then, and it's exhausting now. But it's something that we can't get around. So the real question then is, how do we how do we sort of avoid burnout? What can we do that's meaningful and worthwhile? These are problems that are really hard to solve because for everyone, it's incredibly different. There is no one solution that we can fix for everybody. But what we need to remember is that progress and not perfection is our goal. You just need to try it. You need to keep moving forward. It's not an end game thing. There's always going to be something new to learn. So Gropius actually, he really failed to realize the idealistic dreams that he had in his opening manifesto, but his influence is still really incredibly strong today, almost 100 years later. And the way of thinking that he left behind is enormously influential, not just in the fields of education and in architecture, but also in design and development. So, like I said, there were 3 leaders of the Bauhaus, and each of the Bauhaus directors worked to change and shape the role of design and its intersection in technology and society in his own way. So Gropius sought to eliminate the gap between the artist and the ordinary citizen to bring art to the every person. And he really wanted to make well-designed, high-quality products that were available to the masses. The second director was Hannes Meyer. You won't find a lot about him in the history books. That's starting to change more, but he was politically a little bit unsavory at the time, and so eventually he was thrown out. But during his time as the director of the Bauhaus, he tried to bring to the forefront this social aspect of design and produce goods that would satisfy the needs of what he considered to be the people rather than the luxury. The final director of the Bauhaus reversed a lot of what Meyer did. Like I said, he was politically a little bit not so great at the time. And so van der Rohe, Ludwig van der Rohe, he reversed a lot of these decisions and then refocused the school back on architecture and in particular this connection between building, technology, and aesthetics. And the students and teachers at the Bauhaus stood at the forefront of their industry and they really believed that they could use technology to make the world better. For them, this idea of accessibility enjoyed a much broader context. And so a lot of times it meant back then simply that something was just accessible, period, that it was available, period. Now we sort of have this idea of accessibility being with a screen or being with a particular device. That's true now in the modern context, but really at its core, we assume that people have these devices and these screens. But at the same time, it's really, really important that we remember that we're not supporting devices, we're not supporting screens, we're not supporting things, we're supporting people. And I think that's very different from this idea of I'm going to do something that works on every product. What you really want to do is build something that's accessible by every individual person. So for Gropius, leading the Bauhaus was incredibly exhausting, and he leaned a lot on these masters of form, the teachers at the Bauhaus. And so initially this sort of struggle of keeping the Bauhaus alive, especially in Germany at a time where things were sort of falling apart all over the place, was incredibly just awful, and it brought them together originally. But conflict sort of, it builds on itself, it gets worse. And unfortunately, this sort of collaborative spirit that Gropius had tried to build in the beginning started to fall apart. And so it was exacerbated by this constant shift in vision, this constant shift in teachers. The political scene in Germany was really radical. It was also very oppressive. And this led to sort of an erosion of passion, of collective enthusiasm. People stopped wanting to work together as much. And instead, things sort of started to fall apart all around Gropius, and eventually he left. But during his time leading the Bauhaus, he wanted to create this spirit of, okay, hey, we're all in this together. This was probably really influenced by his time in this organization called the Deutscher Werkbund, which is the German Association of Craftsmen. And so for the rest of his career, sort of looking back at his time at the Bauhaus and thinking, wow, I really tried hard, but things sort of fell apart. He really started to value the idea of partnership over personal, so the idea that we can accomplish more together than we can individually. And so he said this was something that really affected him for the rest of his career. So almost 90 years since the closing of the Bauhaus, we're still confronting the same sort of exhaustion, the same idea of, we're not as enthusiastic sometimes as we used to be when we're building things. And like the masters, we struggle to sort of balance our desire for praise, this idea that we personally built this cool new thing, or we personally tried some new technology, with this struggle to work together to accomplish something as a team. And so this frenetic pace of JavaScript development today really makes the situation worse. We have to master new technologies and support an ever-expanding array of devices. And a lot of times, it's just exhausting. We feel overwhelmed. We feel isolated, sometimes both. And then we're faced with this decision to either become specialists or generalists, and we can't possibly learn everything. And it's really frustrating. So I think what we should do is sort of look back at what Gropius did and say, hey, what we really need to do is establish a set of guiding principles that'll sort of guide our community, they'll guide our work. When we look back and we look at what Gropius achieved, he really didn't actually achieve his initial vision. What he set out to do isn't what's in the history books. But even after the Bauhaus closed, the students and teachers immigrated all around the world and took these ideas with him. So where does this leave us? What does this look through history show us? Gropius hoped to fuse this new technology of mass production with beauty and functionality, and he said that the final goal of all artistic activity is architecture. And so what I'd like to say is that for him, buildings, they represented the coming together of knowledge, of inspiration, and he referred to this by a German word, Gesamtkunstwerk. And so what I think is really cool is I think that the web is our Gesamtkunstwerk. It's this coming together of all of the things. It's our product, it's our culture, it's our industry. And we're not likely to leave behind a physical sort of remnant, the architecture, the buildings, like the Bauhaus was. But 80 years from now, 100 years from now, when people look at us and they say, hey, what did the JavaScript developers of 2015 leave behind? I think the thing that we leave behind is actually our culture, the way that we build things, the way that we work with people, and not the actual things that we leave behind. So I want our legacy to be something we're truly proud of. If you have questions, I'll answer them in the hall, obviously in English or also in German.